Hi, everybody. Today is Thursday, and we are talking about the French and Indian War today. Big topic, actually. So, I'd like to let you know that we had some internet problems yesterday, and my video may have been uploaded at 2 a.m., but that doesn't necessarily mean I made it at 2 a.m. You can rest easy. Although it is after 10 o'clock tonight that I'm finally getting around to this. You'll be happy to know that I finally got my super armor finished in Skyrim. And now I can start playing the game now that I feel the tutorial phase is actually done. Enchanting 100, smithing 100. That's how you do it, kids. So, today we're talking about the French and Indian War. And this was known as the 7 Years' War in Europe. It is a pattern of a larger war that encompassed King George's War, Queen Anne's War, King William's War, the War of Jenkins' Ear. Basically, this whole thing should have been called World War I. It involved pretty much the same people over a very large period of time on multiple continents. And the French and Indian War was largely an economic disagreement between the French and the British, the French colonists and the British colonists in North America. Both wanted land for resources. The French wanted the land so that they could grab resources and take them back. The British colonists wanted to actually take control of the land and begin producing resources to be turned into finished goods. The French may not have actually, the word colonist may not appropriately apply to the French. In any case, George Washington was involved. He kind of started it by shooting at a French encampment, killing a French diplomat. He was then wanted for murder in France, oddly. And the French and Indian War is so called because the French had Indian allies and the British colonists had their own Indian allies. The end of the French and Indian War, of course, disrupted those trade patterns. So when we consider the patterns of continuity and change over time, which is one of the things we think about when writing for the for any question that we're given, we have to consider how things change and how things stayed the same. By the time the French and Indian War was complete, there were very few French left on the continent. Many in Canada had been expelled, and some went to New Orleans. The French and Indian War's outcome, of course, the initial phases of French and Indian War were a disaster. Only after a couple losses did the colonists get their act together. And we don't really talk about battles in the curriculum, and so we talk about causes and consequences. The causes of the French and Indian War are largely economic in nature, based on land tension, and the consequences are an incredible debt burden by the British. In fact, after the French and Indian War, the British become the most heavily taxed people on the planet. And that financial burden led to the British trying to install a more strong taxation system over the colonies. In fact, the British believed that the colonists in North America should bear their own share of that tax burden, despite the fact that those colonists neither started the 7 Years' War or the series of conflicts leading up to the French and Indian War, nor did they actually cost that much money for the British. The British sent some supplies, a couple advisors, but it certainly wasn't a strong investment. The colonists were largely left to themselves. It was kind of a salutary neglect war. And the colonists acquitted themselves very well. Their militias acquitted themselves very well. And Washington, of course, was part of that militia. After the French and Indian War, the admiralty laws were instituted across the Dominion of New England. This removed local government control, local court systems, and local elections. So now salutary neglect is at an end after the French and Indian War. Unfortunately, the British governor of the Dominion of New England then suggested that the French allied Indians be punished after the war. And that punishment took the form of ending trade relationships. And once those trade relationships were ended, an Indian chief named Pontiac decided that was unacceptable, and he and his followers murdered 2,000 settlers in between Fort Pitt and Fort Detroit. And basically every fort controlled by the British colonists was destroyed except Fort Pitt and Fort Detroit in that area. So the British said, you know what? It's dangerous over there across the Appalachian Mountains, and so we're not going to let you go. You colonists want that land. In fact, you fought the French and Indian War to get that land across the Appalachian Mountains, but there's dangerous Indians there, so you probably shouldn't go. In fact, instead of sending troops to protect you in that land, we're going to station troops, they said, in settled territories on the east side of the Appalachian Mountains in order to prevent you from going to that land you just fought a war to gain access to. This was arguably a terrible choice. It was a way to feel like the British were in control. And, of course, people who are in control love to feel like they're in control. In fact, I have only one question for student teachers, which I am receiving fewer and fewer of, largely because I ask this question. But I ask the question, how much control is necessary to know that you're in control? As you know, our classroom experience is not a heavily controlled environment, although everyone seems to be on board with the plan and it works well, largely because of an absence of control. I would argue that too much control ruins the event for everybody, and that's exactly what the British did. The British instituted this tight rein in order to impose taxation because of this war, and the British created the Proclamation Line of 1763, which was the legislation that said, no, you can't cross the Appalachian Mountains and go get that land you wanted. The Proclamation Line, of course, was the trigger for many colonists. Now, for some colonists, the reason they wanted to have a revolution was religious. For some colonists, the reason they wanted to have a revolution was political. For some, it was economic. And for some, it was the Proclamation Line. It was a rejection of the mercantilist values that the colonies had been created for. In fact, Britain didn't do themselves a whole lot of favors by instituting the Proclamation Line. It reduced the amount of raw materials they would receive that they could turn into finished goods. It reduced the expansion to create markets into which those finished goods would be sold. It was really a terrible choice all the way around. After the colonists decided that the French and Indian War didn't turn out the way they wanted, we see a growing pattern of rejection of this British method of control. Now, the government in England, of course, said jump and expected the colonists to ask how high on the way up. The colonists, however, had been governing themselves for largely 80 years. They had mostly run their own war in North America in the French and Indian War. Let's not forget, the colonists had even captured Louisbourg by themselves. Sort of. They had to give it back. Thanks, First Treaty of Utrecht. Is there such a thing as hashtag Treaty of Utrecht, or Second Treaty of Utrecht? Sorry. The colonists at this point have a pattern of rejection. There's a governmental pattern from England in which the desires of the colonists are really not cared for. So afterwards we see a growth of activism, of popular movements. They include the Sons of Liberty, which are going to reject the notion of taxation without representation. They're going to be a little bit more violent. The Sons of Liberty, of course, are led by Samuel Adams. They did a lot of smuggling. The Sons of Liberty tar and feathered tax agents by the time they were done. Within a year of this effort, there were no British stamp tax agents left on the continent. They were fighting against what the British had instituted in the Coercive Acts. It was a series of laws, including the Quartering Act, the stamp tax, a variety of taxes on necessary goods that were designed to make up for the cost of the French and Indian War. And the colonists, first of all, objected to the taxes, even when those taxes were lowered. We see ultimately the tea tax is actually lowered. In fact, all the taxes are either eliminated or lowered over time. And why then, after the tea tax was lowered, did the British colonists dump the tea in the harbor during their pattern of rejection? Well, the Boston Harbor event was simply a recognition that the British were still trying to maintain control. For the colonists at the Boston Tea Party, they knew the tax had been lowered, but they also knew the tax had been maintained. They had not asked for a reduction in the tax. They had asked for an elimination of the tax unless they were going to have a say in their own taxation, which the king had rejected, of course. You've seen Hamilton 10,000 times by this point. We also see that there were boycotts instituted against lead, glass, the shovel thing, remember? Against anything that the British taxed heavily in order to make up the revenue that they thought they needed after the French and Indian War. Now, I'm not arguing that they didn't need the money. In fact, their debt burden, we only find a couple examples historically of a debt burden that big. In fact, today, America's debt burden equals the British debt burden after the French and Indian War. And so we're in a historic place. Congratulations, everybody. And we see a pattern of change over time in the rejection of British control through the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress represents a desire to return to self-government by people who had experience with self-government. One of the things that you have a list, reasons for a revolution. In fact, that list is going to be critical. We found out today, we find out a little bit more every day. But if you're taking the AP test, all the stuff is going to be written. It's going to be a 45-minute event, and it's much less of a test than was previously anticipated. So if you have questions about this new AP test style, which will be done at home, you should contact your counselor, not your history teacher. I think that's going to be the right answer, because there's nothing I can do about it. I simply deliver the content, and the counselors manage the test. So I'm off the hook on that one. I hope you have all had a great Thursday. I look forward to Friday. When you return tomorrow, we're actually going to be talking about the revolution itself. I hope you're being entertained in some way. I will see what I can do about helping out tomorrow. Stay safe.